Deep within the thick forests of upstate New York, 143 unmarked graves were unearthed in 1862, hidden beneath the rotting floorboards of a long-abandoned church. The authorities who examined the remains recorded chilling details: fractured bones that had healed before death, evidence of repeated near-drownings, and strange carvings etched directly into the skeletons. For more than 160 years, federal archives relating to the Church of the Pure Spirit remained sealed, available only to those with the highest levels of clearance, but I've managed to obtain documents never before seen by the public records that expose how 3 brothers, Elder Ezra, Deacon Silas, and Prophet Caleb Ravencroft, lured hundreds of believers into a twisted faith that taught suffering as the only road to salvation. Their so-called purification rituals would lay the foundations for what may be the darkest cult in American history. The settlement of Ravenwood, New York, about 40 miles north of Albany, was a quiet and unremarkable farming town in the early 1800s, established in 1803 by settlers moving north from the Hudson Valley. Its 300 residents lived by agriculture, timber, and trade. But like much of upstate New York during that era, Ravenwood lay at the very heart of the Second Great Awakening, sweeping religious revival that transformed the region into what historians later called the burned-over district, where fiery preachers and new faiths spread like wildfire. Into this fervent landscape came the Ravencroft brothers in the summer of 1825. Elder Ezra, then 42, commanded attention with eyes so dark they seemed to strip away pretense from anyone he looked upon. Silas, 3 years younger, bore the ink-stained hands and quiet intellect of a lifelong scholar. The youngest, Prophet Caleb, was unsettling to many, his pale eyes rolling back during visions, his whispering voice carrying unnaturally across rooms, mesmerizing and eerie all at once. The brothers purchased a vast tract of land outside Ravenwood and immediately began raising a church unlike any in the area. Constructed from black stone quarried from nearby hills, it stood in stark contrast to the modest white wooden meeting houses common throughout New England. Its central octagonal sanctuary, ringed by 8 smaller chambers and topped with a towering steeple, loomed over the countryside. Most disturbing, however, was its lack of windows, the sanctuary illuminated only by carefully placed lanterns during services. At their first gathering, Elder Ezra declared, "We are called by the Spirit to this place. In an age of false prophets and empty faith, we bring the true path, purification through tribulation." Their timing could not have been better, with Methodists, Baptists, and countless revivalist sects drawing thousands to outdoor sermons, and new American-born religions like Mormonism just emerging. The Ravencroft message took root. Their teaching was stark true. Salvation required suffering, not symbolic trials, but physical pain. The body is the vessel of sin, Deacon Silas explained. Only when it is tested, broken, and purified can the Spirit ascend. The congregation grew quickly. Converts were often the desperate, the grieving, or the wealthy disillusioned with mainstream churches. One early follower, Margaret Wilkins, a widow who had lost her husband and children to scarlet fever later, wrote in her journal, "He looked at me as though he could read my soul. He told me my suffering had meaning, that it prepared me for a higher calling. For the first time since burying my family, I felt hope." By 1827, nearly 100 members were living in or around the compound. The Ravencrofts urged their followers to give up worldly possessions, claiming attachment to property blocked spiritual ascent. The most devoted were named vessels of the Spirit and subjected to harsher rituals, days of fasting, endless night vigils, and repeated immersions in freezing water. But like a frog in slowly heating water, the congregation barely noticed how each ritual became darker, harsher, more dangerous. By 1829, with underground chambers dug beneath the church, the brothers held complete dominion over both the bodies and minds of their followers. The turning point came on December 21, 1829, the winter solstice. in secret records. It was later called the First Ascension. That night, 150 members crowded into the windowless sanctuary. 12 candles burned at the points of a massive spiral carved into the wooden floor, all leading to a central platform. Survivor testimony later revealed that Prophet Caleb, appearing deathly pale and possessed, convulsed and spoke in a bizarre language he claimed was angelic. Rising to his feet, he named 3 followers chosen for elevation: Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters, bound to inverted crosses. They endured what the brothers called the 7 trials of purification: mock drownings, simulated burials, burns from heated irons, submersion in freezing water, and other horrors too gruesome to describe in detail. All the while, the congregation was made to chant, "Through suffering comes purity, through purity comes elevation." By dawn, the victims were broken, but alive until Prophet Caleb laid his hands upon them. Witnesses swore their bodies convulsed violently, bones snapping, as they screamed in Caleb's angelic tongue. Moments later, all 3 were dead. Elder Ezra proclaimed them ascended, their souls bypassing judgment and entering heaven. Their corpses were not buried. Instead, they were placed in the catacombs beneath the church, laid out as relics to be revered. These were the first of what would eventually be hundreds of bodies entombed below the Church of the Pure Spirit. Though some fled Ravenwood in fear, most remained. Far from shattering the congregation, murder sanctified it. Death itself had become sacrament. From that night forward, the Ravencroft brothers tightened their grip, refining their doctrine and expanding their underground chambers into a sprawling labyrinth of preparation, trials, ascension, and the so-called Chamber of Saints, where corpses of the ascended were preserved like holy icons. By the 1830s, the ceremonies grew more frequent. By the 1840s, they were held monthly, often claiming children as the purest offerings. The brothers' outward charity donations to temperance groups, orphanages, and local causes masked the nightmare hidden in their catacombs, and for decades, no one outside Ravenwood ever suspected the scale of the horror beneath the Black Stone Church. From 1830 through 1845, the Church of the Pure Spirit transformed into something that, at a distance, appeared respectable. To outsiders, the Ravencroft brothers projected the image of charitable clergymen, men of faith, dedicated to community service, sobriety, and spiritual renewal. They hosted gatherings with other preachers, donated to orphanages, and even funded public works in Ravenwood. But beneath this carefully constructed facade, their rituals of elevation grew ever more elaborate, ever more fatal. The underground chambers expanded year by year, until the catacombs stretched far beyond the church's foundations, carved into a subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and hidden sanctuaries. What had begun as simple cellars became a network of purpose-built rooms, each dedicated to the theology of pain. The Chamber of Preparation isolated chosen vessels for days without food or light, breaking their will. The Chamber of Trials was where the 7 purifications, mock drowning, burial, burning, freezing, and more were inflicted. The Chamber of Ascension became the stage of death, where the final rituals ended in convulsions and silence. And the most dreadful of all, the Chamber of Saints. Here, the dead were preserved, their corpses embalmed, posed in positions of prayer or ecstasy, their bones arranged in grotesque tableaux. Some were displayed upright, their skeletal hands lifted, as though in worship. Others were wired into lifelike poses, frozen mid-gesture, as if their devotion had been captured for eternity. Elizabeth Carver, a former member, who fled in 1844, later confessed to federal investigators, "The first time I entered the Chamber of Saints, I wept as though I were gazing upon holy relics. I believed it was beauty, not horror. Only after I escaped did I understand the deception that I had been trained to see corpses as sanctity." By 1835, the ceremonies were no longer rare. What had begun with only a handful of ascensions, each year grew into quarterly rituals. By 1840, they were monthly occurrences. Solstices and equinoxes were marked with special great elevations, sometimes claiming half a dozen lives in a single night. The choice of candidates became more brazen. At first, the Ravencrofts selected the lonely, the widowed, the orphaned, the drifters, who would not be missed. But in time, their hunger grew. Parents were urged to present their children as offerings, told that the purest blood brought the greatest blessings. Carver remembered, families competed for the honor. To give your child to the spirit was seen as the highest devotion. Mothers wept with pride, not grief, as their sons and daughters were taken to the chambers. It chills me even now. Within the church, each brother maintained his role. Elder Ezra was the commanding voice, delivering sermons with authority. Deacon Silas cloaked their atrocities in scripture, writing endless treatises, justifying suffering as divine law. And Prophet Caleb, his influence grew the most. By the 1840s, it was Caleb who alone chose candidates for ascension. His visions became the unquestioned law of the congregation. But Caleb himself was unraveling. Journals later recovered from his chambers revealed sketches of human anatomy covered with cryptic notations. One entry from 1842 reads, "The soul is not bound to heart or mind alone, but scattered through the body's sacred nodes awaiting release. Each elevation shows me more. Soon I will hold the divine map entire." As the number of ascensions increased, a practical problem arose: what to do with the excess remains. The catacombs could only hold so many bodies, even embalmed and arranged. It was then that the brothers devised a grotesque solution. In the 1840s, medical schools across the Northeast were desperate for cadavers to dissect. The law provided only the bodies of executed criminals, far too few to meet demand. Quietly, the Ravencrofts began selling corpses to anatomy departments in Albany, Boston, even New York City. To outsiders, they became trusted suppliers. To insiders, they preached that even the body, once emptied of the soul, could serve a holy purpose by aiding science. By 1845, the church's membership swelled to nearly 300. On the surface, Ravenwood flourished, the cult bringing prosperity with donations and trade. But beneath that prosperity, the Blackstone Church grew darker, its chambers packed with relics of flesh and bone, and as the brothers' power deepened, so too did the depravity of their rituals. By the 1850s, whispers spread in Ravenwood, whispers of disappearances, of children never seen again, of strange lights glowing beneath the ground. Yet still, no one dared confront the Ravencrofts, for the congregation, death, had become the highest sacrament. By the dawn of the 1850s, the Church of the Pure Spirit had reached its height. Nearly 300 members called themselves disciples of the Ravencroft brothers, and the church compound had grown into a self-contained world. Crops were raised on church lands, workshops produced goods for trade, and most members lived in small cabins encircling the Blackstone sanctuary. To outsiders, Ravenwood appeared prosperous and devout. The church gave generously to temperance societies, orphanages, and local charities, earning admiration from neighboring towns. But beneath this facade, the rituals of elevation had become a regular rhythm of life. At least once a month, chosen vessels entered the catacombs and never returned. By now, the ceremonies had taken on an almost theatrical scale. Witnesses who later escaped described processions lit by dozens of lanterns, the congregation chanting as they descended into the earth. The trials themselves grew harsher with each decade, more elaborate, more prolonged, more fatal. Where once the 7 purifications ended swiftly, now they could last for days. Prophet Caleb's influence was absolute. His visions dictated who would ascend, when ceremonies would take place, and how the rituals were to be performed. By this time, his behavior had grown erratic, his pale eyes rolled back for hours, his body convulsing in seizures that followers believed were signs of divine possession. In his journals, he wrote obsessively of the divine anatomy, sketching diagrams of bones, organs, and nerves marked with strange symbols. The soul, he wrote in 1851, is a lattice of light woven through the flesh. Each elevation frees one thread. When all threads are revealed, the spirit's design will be known. But not all members remained loyal. Rumors began to leak beyond Ravenwood. Travelers reported strange smells wafting from the church grounds, an odor of chemicals and decay. Some claimed to hear cries echoing through the forest on nights of elevation. A few families slipped away under cover of darkness, abandoning their homes to escape the grip of the Ravencroft of T.S. In 1856, a physician in Albany grew suspicious of the unusually steady supply of cadavers being delivered to local medical colleges. Records of origin were vague, often simply marked church donation. Though whispers spread, no one dared accuse the Ravencrofts directly. The brothers had cultivated powerful allies through wealth and influence. Still, cracks were forming. That same year, a young woman named Abigail Miller managed to flee the compound after being selected for elevation. Weak, frostbitten, and delirious, she stumbled into a neighboring village. Her account was fragmented, filled with ramblings of trials, fire, and chanting. Most dismissed her as insane. Yet her story reached a federal agent stationed in Albany who had long harbored suspicions about Ravenwood. By the late 1850s, federal investigators quietly began compiling files on the Church of the Pure Spirit. Agents interviewed deserters, tracked the movement of bodies sold to medical schools, and noted the sealed catacombs beneath the church. But concrete evidence remained elusive. The Ravencroft brothers were careful, disciplined, and protected by the fanatical devotion of their flock. Then came 1861, the outbreak of the Civil War. Ravenwood sent few men to fight. Those who did, often deserted and returned to the compound. Suspicion deepened. Rumors spread that the Ravencrofts had declared the war a divine cleansing and were preparing for their greatest elevation yet. It was the following year, 1862, when investigators finally forced entry into the church. What they found beneath the Blackstone sanctuary horrified even hardened soldiers. Chamber after chamber, filled with the dead bodies, embalmed, mummified, or reduced to clean skeletons, posed in silent worship. At least 143 were counted in that first sweep, though some believed the number to be far higher. Many of the bones bore carving spirals, symbols, even entire passages etched with knives into the marrow itself. The Ravencroft brothers were nowhere to be found. Some claimed they fled into the forests during the raid, others whispered they sealed themselves within hidden passages of the catacombs, becoming saints of their own making. Their fate remains uncertain. Federal records on the Church of the Pure Spirit were sealed soon after hidden from the public, perhaps because the full extent of the horrors was too much for the nation to face in the midst of war. For more than a century, only fragments have surfaced: testimonies, journal pages, architectural sketches of the catacombs. But those who know the story of Ravenwood agree on one point: the Ravencroft brothers left behind more than corpses. They left behind a doctrine, a belief that suffering is the only true path to salvation. And though their church was buried, whispers of that doctrine have surfaced again and again in strange communities across the country. The Church of the Pure Spirit may be gone, but the seed it planted has never fully died.